Welcome to the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute's 90th anniversary celebration. For our 90th anniversary, we've been making a series of videos and highlighting the contributions of the scholarship and practitioners from the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute to the field of psychoanalysis and its allied disciplines. And it's our way of celebrating this 90th anniversary and recognizing some of the important contributions that have come out of the Chicago Institute over the course of its history since 1932. Today we have the pleasure of learning about the work of Michael Basch. Michael Basch was a faculty member, training and supervising analyst here in Chicago for many years. When I first was a young social worker clinician in Chicago, I remember hearing Mike Basch speak, and one of the things that he said, and it has stuck with me since then, he was the one who introduced me to Freud's saying, "You cannot slay the devil in absentia," which of course is the mantra for how psychotherapy and psychoanalysis really can make a difference in people's lives. He has that kind of impact on people. He's a very clear, thoughtful speaker, and many of us have learned about Mike Basch through his 4 classic textbooks on the doing psychotherapy, practicing psychotherapy, understanding psychotherapy, and doing brief psychotherapy. They are manuals and guides for clinicians of all levels of experience, I think. So today we have with us to talk about the work of Mike Basch, Charles Jaffe. Charles is a training and supervising analyst here at the Chicago Institute. He has been involved in probably just about every aspect of the Institute over his many years here. But important for our conversation today, Michael Basch was Charles's mentor. Charles is now retired, but was an assistant professor at Rush Medical Center, where he initially taught residents the art and practice of psychotherapy and the science of psychotherapy with Mike Basch. And they traveled together, presented together, and Charles has been significantly influenced by the work of Mike Basch, and today he's here to speak with us about it. So welcome, Charles. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about Michael Basch, the man.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll tell you the reason I really wanted to do this. It's because, and forgive me if I get a little verklempt about this, but I really love Mike. I mean, he was, I met him when I was a resident at Michael Reese in the mid-70s. He was a supervisor when I was a resident. I chose him as a supervisor when I was a candidate. And he just really opened himself up to teaching me, I'm absolutely sure that without him I wouldn't have had the career trajectory I've had. He was incredibly supportive. He invited me along to travel with him, to teach with him, to learn with him, to read his books before they got published. So yeah, I really loved him and continued to. I can't believe it's been 25 years, since he died. And there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him and use his thoughts along the way. So that's why I want to do this.
Great.
I had the privilege of being able to deliver one of his eulogies at Rush, where he was a named professor. He was the Cynthia, I think you pronounce it, Udion Harris Chair of Psychiatry at Rush. He started there in 1983, took that named chair in 1992, and then it was, he died January 24th of 1996, so it really was a very rich but short period of time that he held that chair. So I was actually skiing in Telluride the day he died, and got on a plane and came back here, gave his eulogy, and then went back to Colorado. So it was really, in every sense, a labor of loving him and celebrating him. So he was a guy that was profound, as a beacon of systematic operational approaches to psychoanalytic clinical work and to metapsychology. I have recently been in touch with Gail Basch, his daughter, who's also a psychiatrist in practice at Rush, and she was very generous in helping me to gather some information. So Mike was born May 5th, 1929 in Berlin. And when the Nazis came to power in 1933, Jewish children weren't allowed to go to school. So his earliest education apparently was secretly in the homes of members of the community. His father was a physician, Martin, and they tried for years to get a visa to emigrate, but because his mother, Lily, was developing Parkinson's disease, they had a lot of trouble getting out of the country because of issues with immigrants becoming a burden on society. So finally in 1939,
in the nick of time, 6 years later, they boarded a luxury liner to the United States, and the family says that it was to be the last fine food and entertainment that this otherwise fairly well-to-do Jewish family would have, because it took a couple of years for his father to get retrained and to be able to do another internship, like immigrants still, and to be able to return to practice. And during that time, they were largely supported by an immigrant charity organization. So Mike and his sister Catherine they lived on the north side in sort of the Edgewater uptown area, and they went to Haight Elementary School, where apparently he met Mark Berger, another one of our beloved and esteemed friends and colleagues, and they were friends throughout their entire lives. And in fact, Mark also gave one of the eulogies at Rush, and I remember that he was so overcome by it that his wife Barbara had to actually deliver his words. They were friends throughout. At any rate, Mike went to Senn High School, and also, and I didn't know this, but apparently he played percussion in the ROTC band. Somehow he got a bicycle, and his first job was making deliveries for a florist. He attended Temple Shalom and was confirmed and took classes in Judaism. And his family notes that he wasn't really a very good student in high school. He was pretty critical of the students. But then he went to college at Loyola University of Chicago, which is a Jesuit school. And that's when he really took off. And I think that any of us who knew Mike could see that influence, because he was very, very specific and clear and careful and detailed about his thinking and the way he went about things, and it has that kind of quality, that kind of scholarly Jesuit quality to it. He went to Loyola for medical school as well, and then did his psychiatric residency at Michael Reese. I was visiting with his wife Carol in their home just a few days before he died, and I was reminiscing with her about his progression of intellectual arguments, which always seemed to follow such a clear line. And she said that actually he struggled repeatedly to find a direction, and that she often had to cajole and push and believe in him where he kind of couldn't kind of keep his own confidence up. He agonized about every thought, and there was that, he had a kind of quality of his speech which was sort of hesitating. It wasn't a stammer. It was I gotta make sure that each word is exactly correct, in kind of a quality about him. So it gave him a kind of very sort of professorial
a little bit distant quality, but I always thought that there was a kind of twinkle in his eye behind it, you know, and a sort of self, a kind of humility of himself. So, you know, his family was very supportive of him, and so his work, I think, not only represents his gifts, but the gifts that his wife and kids gave, you know, in support of him. We used to joke that Mike slept in a three-piece suit because he always wore a three-piece suit and nobody ever saw him in anything other than a three-piece suit. And I also learned, I think it was at the memorial service, that maybe it was Mark Berger, and his comments said that whenever they would go out to dinner, Mike would also always order the veal, which was the most expensive thing on the menu. And you know, it was always sort of quirky, but then when I learned about this early history and how they struggled, these are sort of things that just sort of came through about his early life. So we were super lucky to get him, you know, as a teacher and as a scholar. What I want to do is a couple of things. I think I can't really remember Mike.
Can I just ask you to say how he got interested in psychoanalysis?
I don't know how he got interested in psychoanalysis. Okay. I don't know what brought him to psychiatry. I wish I did. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe I can go back and ask the family, and we can splice that in to the conversation. But I don't know.
Well, it's so interesting because this was so much his home. Yeah.
So much his home. And I'll ask Gail about that. You know, it does. There are a lot of things about him that he didn't share a lot about himself personally. Because that was that very formal quality about him. Like when I saw that he played percussion in high school, you know, I'm a drummer. If I'd known that, I would have been all over that, but I never knew that about him. And I guess out of respect and, you know, kind of looking up to him, there are things that there was a sort of boundary I didn't cross. But yeah, I would like to know that too. So, to really, I think there's so much about him that was so intellectually towering that I wanted to spend some time kind of reviewing the progression of his ideas. Because one of the things I think that's really important is that, you know, in the time that Mike wrote, from 73 to his death at 96, there were huge changes that went on in the field. And he was a significant piece of that, but it turned out in those years to not be the dominant piece. Now it's emerging as absolutely the dominant forward piece, and there's so much in what he did that was prescient.
You're thinking about his work about affect?
I'm thinking about his work about he took everything and everybody to task. His work about affect, his work about development, his work about integrating psychoanalysis with infant development, baby watchers, cognitive development, general systems theory, affect theory, communication science, the whole idea of revising metapsychology so that psychoanalysis remained grounded in biological sciences and in Freud. And this happened at a time when the field kind of split in three different directions. The field was, you know, with the dismantling of Freud's edifice. I think of it as like the three baby bells emerging from the dissolution of Ma Bell, right? And there were the ego psychology people who continued to use the language, but didn't really worry about the fact that it wasn't grounded in anything operational. There were the relational subjectivists who decided that psychoanalysis was going to become part of philosophy. And we also had, you know, Arnold Goldberg was huge in that here. So we sort of had some of everything. And then there were those like Mike Basch and John Ghetto who really wanted to keep psychoanalysis grounded in biological developmental science, and that's what they did.
So the place of psychoanalysis in relation to the allied disciplines was something that he really helped create.
Right.
A ground.
Mike thought that psychotherapy and psychoanalysis was applied developmental psychology.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted to know the metapsychology or understanding the science behind the art, you couldn't look within psychoanalysis because you couldn't get that from the couch.
Mm-hmm.
So his earliest work was basically about an epistemology of psychoanalytic knowledge. So he wrote that there were three things. There was classificatory theory, which is basically just saying, we see this phenomenon, we're going to call it X, right? Patients do this kind of stuff over and over again. We're going to call it transference. We're going to call it Oedipal complex. We're going to call it resistance. But those are just labels for things that happen. And then the other thing that you can do with psychoanalysis, he argued in this 1973 paper, is you can have a descriptive explanatory theory. And a descriptive explanatory theory is essentially X happened in childhood, and so now we have we can understand why in your adulthood. Because what happens earlier sits around, gets repeated, so that's a kind of explanatory theory. But what you can't get from the couch is a causal explanatory theory, which is, well, why do those things happen?
Mm-hmm.
How does that happen? And that's where Freud's metapsychology was speculative. It was, great for the time, but it was based on what we now know was a lot of outmoded concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And what he really wanted to do was revise metapsychology. So he was really interested in talking about how psychoanalysis has gotten really kind of tangled up in itself by confusing descriptive, classificatory, and explanatory theory, and trying to separate those things out, which allowed clinical theory to exist and flourish, but on a whole different groundwork. That's where he started. And then what he did from there was he sort of took apart every single aspect, and he did a lot of writing about affect. He did a paper on the revision of affect, chapter 7, the revision of the theory of affect. And he revised Freud's concepts of that and put it in the language of communication science and what was being learned about the development of affect theory. And we know that he drew a great deal from Sylvan Tompkins, who was an early pioneer in this. He was the guy who said, well, basically, affect is part of the autonomic nervous system that's registered and communicated in the musculature of the face. So Tompkins's protege, I forget his first name, Izzard was his, he was the one that did those wonderful pictures of how babies, will respond to actors' faces just a few hours after birth. So Mike was very into looking at communication science and the revision of affect as a way to say, yes, affect really is important, like Freud said, but not for the not for the reasons that he said. And then he did the same thing with looking at development, and he wrote his next series of works were really about integrating psychoanalytic theories of development with cognitive development. So it wasn't the emergence of the stages of development that Freud had and the ones that we generally think of now could be really linked not just to the vicissitudes of drive transformation, but in fact cognitive development, right? And the little people just don't think like
something
middle-sized people and big people.
Right. Something that psychoanalysis really hasn't embraced very much.
That's been an
Even
ongoing
now,
struggle,
yeah.
even now. Right. So he was very much about that. And then and I'm skipping around a little bit here, but in Understanding Psychotherapy, which he wrote in 1988, I think, he really incorporated the work of Daniel Stern, who had written this book in 1985, Interpersonal World of the Infant, where he was a baby watcher, but he was very interested in the subjective experience of people, little people, as they developed into big people. So he integrated all of that stuff. And at the same time, Mike was also part of Kohut's original study group. And I forget all the names of the people, but it included Ghetto, the Ornsteins, David Terman, who else from around here was in that early group? I'm sorry, their names aren't all popping to mind. But they were part of the group that Kohut nurtured.
It was the Tolpins and Ernest
The
Wolfe.
Tolpins, thank you, and Ernest Wolfe. They were all part of that early group. So Mike was very respectful, always, of Kohut and what self-psychology brought to broadening our understanding. But he subjected Kohut's work to the same kind of critical, systematic, careful scrutiny as everything else. And he would say, there's objects and there are self-objects. So at a time when self-psychology was becoming the overarching, superordinate organizing theory of development, Mike was there saying, not so fast, you guys, right? Yes, there is this phenomenon, but the idea of mirroring, kinship, and merger, or an idealization, could be understood as general principles of human development, not just specific early archaic childhood needs. And so he took those things and he broadened them out and incorporated it.
And how much influence did he have on the self-psychologists in that way of thinking, in that approach?
I can't really speak to that particularly, but I think they were kind of pretty much off on their own relational direction at that point. And they were, there was a whole, it became very, very popular, but that's where that division happened. That Mike was interested in grounding all of this in a valid biological basis. And I think they were much more interested in the interpersonal, intersubjective, relational, and its connections with philosophy. And they argued, again, this is definitely not my area of expertise, but I think they argued that psychoanalysis really was a part of the philosophical hermeneutic tradition, and that yes, we know that minds exist in brains, but that's not really the purview of psychoanalysis. Whereas for people like Mike and John Ghetto, it was absolutely, the only thing that was going to keep psychoanalysis afloat in the world is if they could find a way to integrate it into what was this explosion of what was being learned about how the brain makes mind, in addition to what the mind makes. And I think that, he presented and we presented together at the self-psychology meetings, but when we did, it was really to point those things out. So he talked about that. He was ever respectful of Kohut and self-psychology. So I would say to him sometimes, being a little bit provocative like I can be sometimes, you do understand, don't you, that this is really questioning the foundations of all of that, right? This is a radical departure from what's growing up in self-psychology. And he would just sort of nod and go on, because he knew perfectly well that that's what it was. But he also had been mentored and was very respectful. He left it to other people like John Ghetto to be more provocative. And actually, in that regard, in 1979, when Ghetto wrote Beyond Interpretation, which is his first really stepping out after the 73 book with Ghetto and Goldberg. I had a talk with John at one point, and I said, this is really based on Mike's work. Why did you put the chapter about Mike's work at the end of the book? And he said, because my editor told me that the world wasn't ready. Which I thought was very interesting, and so there was a closeness between the two of them about this need to keep psychoanalysis as part of science. But the world wasn't ready, so they were both sort of jockeying with how to do this. So he covered perception, instinct, repression, affect, and the process of theory making itself. And he wrote a lot about disavowal, which I got interested in. So before we leave this part of it, I just want to give you essentially sort of like a flyover of the development of his ideas over time. And the reason that I want to do that is that in this very systematic scholarly review of psychoanalytic practice, clinical theory, and metapsychology, he went through a whole series of things that remain very, very important for us to think about, and that I think, in a way that was under-recognized, set the stage for what's currently now happening. So I just want to give you, so we started off by talking about, in 1973, the fundamentals of epistemology. And then the next thing he took up was disavowal. He went then into talking about Freud's theory of thought formation and consciousness itself, and tried to make metapsychology come in line with established findings on theories of perception. Then he introduced affect theory into the mix. And then the next thing he did, which I think is critically important, is he introduced general systems theory as the foundational theory of order and organization. And the principles of general systems theory is what drives human development. Not drive, but general systems theory drives human development, which was a critical resetting the foundation. So that led him to a series of articles where he argued that the mental apparatus was unnecessary, that instead we needed communication science and the theory of affect or biology as the underpinnings, and not psychic apparatus, which was pretty radical stuff in its day.
Yes.
And remains so. So he talked about the psychic apparatus being speculative and not data-driven, and what we needed was validated, systematic, observable data. That brought him to talk about Piaget, Vygotsky, Luria, in terms of language development and how learning occurs. And he makes the statement in his 1977 paper on developmental psychology and explanatory theory that no school of psychoanalysis can possibly just decide what's really going on, which again, in the 21st century, the problem of division of schools and how to get beyond schoolism, which I might say is one of Erica's contributions to education here at the Institute in the 21st century, was really set kind of, all those years ago. So then he continued to integrate cybernetics, feed-forward and feedback systems, general systems theory, and he began to then use that for theories of maturation, insight, interpretation, essentially grounding psychotherapies in a developmental process. Then came Kohut, and there were a whole series of papers about Kohut where he reviewed, he talked about the problem of getting too far along with clinical models and forgetting where they came from, and that was his way of very respectfully telling the self-psychologist, you have to be careful about how you develop this idea. That was in 1981, which was very much in the middle of the burgeoning of self-psychology. And then in '83, he wrote what I think is his most seminal work of all, which was Empathic Understanding, a review of the concept and theoretical. And that's when he really operationalized how you get to know another's mind. And in this day of mentalization and mirror neurons and all of the kinds of things that people are talking about, that work, I think, was really the most creative, seminal piece and really a turning point. Then
and was that a response to Kohut in some way, or part of Basch's expansion of his thinking?
It was an expansion of his thinking, not so much a response to Kohut, but because it was part of the dialogue of the time. My understanding is that every paper written, in psychoanalysis is part of a conversation. So these people are all products of the historical period in which those conversations were going on and what the conversations were. So we know that, when you're prompting this, of course, is that Kohut's interest in vicarious introspection and empathic immersion was a huge topic at the time, and Mike wanted to ground that in science as well as everything else. So it came from. I don't think it was a contradiction, but it was part of that conversation.
So that's always his theme, is grounding.
Always.
Yeah.
Always grounding it, and making it. And I think that's really what really grabbed me about him is that it was very practical, it was very operational, and it demanded reason behind it, not belief, not religion, but reason and grounding. And I just thought that was such an amazing breath of fresh air. And then he went on with critiques of to respond to the critiques of psychoanalysis as science, which was also very big in the mid '80s, with whether or not what kind of science, was it a science, was it philosophy? That's when that big split happened, and he was right in there, as part of that conversation. And then he had an operational definition of self. He said, okay, if we're going to be self-psychologists, we need an operational definition of self. So he wrote about that and the significance of the theory of affect in self and in technique. And that brought him, really, the last thing was in 1994 when he took on the self-psychologist in this very respectful way, the self-object concept, clinical implications he wrote about. And it was essentially a critique of Kohut. He distinguished self-object needs from object relating in an intact self, and was a strong critic of the rejection of meta theory just because Freud was flawed. And that's where and then that was in 1994, and he died 2 years later. So you can see that he really got into that whole period in a very robust way that tried to clear the dust and the smoke.
But what was his operational definition of self?
His operational definition of self was that it came from a notion of general systems theory and of a self-system, which is not subjective self, right? There's a self-system, there's a self-organization, which is what Ghetto talked about, which is the behavioral organization. And then there's subjectivity and one's own subjective experience of self-continuity. So the operational definition of self was at that level of self-organization and the subjective experience of one moving through life in an ordered and organized way within the system of what he called the spiral of competence.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing was based on general systems theory and cybernetics and communication science.
Mm-hmm.
That was his operational definition of self.
Thank you.
And subjectivity was the way we experience it, but that was just the readout of the process, which is
kind of amazing.
Kind of amazing.
So you've given us a great sense of the breadth of his work and the way in which he carried this theme throughout everything that he did as a theoretician, as a scholar. And now he's going to apply it to clinical practice and the art and science of psychotherapy.
Right.
So can you talk a bit about his contributions that I think many psychotherapists know Mike Basch through his texts on doing and practicing psychotherapy?
Well, I think that one of the most profound things that he could do is he could translate all this arcane psychoanalyse concepts into English, into operationally usable clinical stories. And that, to me, because of my own background, being able to say something in English was incredibly powerful. And that's what these books were. They were all based on clinical stories that illustrated ways of thinking about human development, interaction, psychopathology, that drew from these things that I've talked about, but didn't really state many of them directly, except in understanding psychotherapy. He did go more into Daniel Stern's work and cybernetics and general systems theory and that kind of stuff. But otherwise, the other books, it was very, very practical, and he developed this idea that runs through all the books about the spiral of competence.
I was just going to ask about that, so talk about
The
it.
spiral of competence is basically a feed-forward feedback system where you receive an input, you process it in the context of your understanding, you then behave, and then you assess the feedback based on your behavior. Extraordinarily simple. Cybernetics, now we think of it more as the emergence of self-organization. But basically, the idea is that if it works, you gain competence in the sense of you do the world competently, and that the subjective experience of that is an increase in self-esteem. So it's an upward spiral. If any part of that doesn't work, like if you can't process what comes in, or if the meaning of what comes in is so disruptive, which is a lot of what we deal with, right? You do something, it reminds me of something that I can't handle. I have an odd response to that. You then see me acting oddly, and then you get odd, in response to me. And that's how we get disrupted internally and interpersonally. So as long as it works, the spiral goes up. And then if it gets derailed, at any point, I can't process what comes in, I can't think about what comes in, my behavior is inappropriate, so the feedback, and it can get derailed anywhere along that line. It's not just because of unresolved childhood conflicts and repressed drives, and it's a practical thing that happens throughout life.
And of course, competence is a word that psychoanalysts don't use very much.
Not in that way. But he used competence as the way he used to talk about it was function according to design. That it wasn't an ideal thing. It was the optimal operation of your system, whatever that was, whatever limits, whatever constitutional factors came with it. And so it was very human. It was very...
So you're making optimal use of the resources you have.
Exactly. Optimal use of the resources that you have. And so that set many things just for clinicians. It set a more realistic and obtainable, right, goal. You do the best you can with what you got. And so that was practical and reassuring. He also had what he called the sectors of development, and I think they were attachment, exploration, cognition. I mean, they're things that we don't really think about now, but what we do think about is that competent functioning in the world is in the context of a number of factors. And you can define those factors in different ways. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that as you do life to optimize your working in the world, you bring to it things. And I think that was one of the things that now is very connected to what we're learning from people like Mark Solms and Jaak Panksepp, who are telling us about 7 emotional drives. Not the way that Freud thought about it, but survival strategies in the world and how we use those throughout life, because they're all operational, all through development. Those are the things that we draw upon fundamentally to be optimal. So anyway, in teaching these things, the residents at Rush came to affectionately call this the spring and the pie, because that's what the pictures look like in the book, the spring and the pie. So he would, and it was helpful because you could translate it into these images that worked for everyday clinicians. So the spring and the pie was one of them. Another one was, these are just sort of the ones that stand out for me, is become a master of the obvious. In doing psychotherapy, he made this point that you do psychotherapy primarily by listening very carefully to what people are saying and not importing all kinds of theoretical notions that you then impose on it. Mike didn't say this, but Saul Bellow said that of course psychoanalysts know what's in patients' unconscious because they put it there. And that's just what Mike was trying to get away from. So he would encourage students not to impose pathological notions, but to look right in front of your nose and become a master of the obvious. And that was tied to another part of the spring in the pie, which is we need to think about normal development. He was very big in teaching normal development, that we shouldn't begin by thinking that every patient needs an analysis for their abnormal development. We should use normal development as a model and look at derailments from that. And again, this notion of the spring in the pie. And that the therapy works because you look at people's strengths and how things that they were good at, they can no longer do. And how do you help understand that and help them resume development? So it was all very kind of optimistic in its approach. And he extended that in the book on brief psychotherapy when he said another one of his, what I think of these great Baschisms, which is all therapy should be brief until proven otherwise, which I think is a very powerful concept. That again, you don't think, everybody needs a couch. Everybody needs 4 or 5 days a week in-depth, regression to dependence. If they do, let them teach you that. But in the beginning, if you begin with this model of normative development, and somewhere along the line people got derailed from being able to be competent, then oftentimes you can restore their functioning really pretty quickly, which again I think was a very, very practical, usable, optimistic approach. So that's what he was using all of these ideas and bringing them to.
So the spring is the spiral of competence.
The spring is the spiral of competence.
And the pie is?
The pie is the sectors of development,
Okay.
love, work, and play, or
Attachment exploration,
sexuality,
cognition,
sensuality. People have had different notions about that. Joe Lichtenberg talked about the 5 functional motivational systems.
Right.
Those were all like sectors. And now we think of it more in, the neurobiology of the brainstem and the limbic system, about what are the domains of emotion that have kept us going for the last 250 million years, that then become the foundation, the tools that we use to navigate the world. But that's what he was talking about. And I think that one of the real sadnesses for Mike was that he didn't live long enough to see the first 20 years of the 21st century happen, where this stuff is just all over the place now. I mean, he would have gotten such a kick out of the mirror neuron research, which happened like in the late 90s, like right when he died. He just missed that. And I talked to him very much towards the end of his life. We would have dinner. I guess it was a private club in the Drake Hotel. And of course, he was a member. And when in the release of, I think it was Understanding Psychotherapy, there was a book party for him there. But he and I had dinner there occasionally. And this was just before he first got disoriented, which was the first indication of his brain tumor. And we were talking about what he wanted to do next. And he said, the next book I want to write is all about what Freud got right and what Freud got wrong. And I want to look at that. And that's exactly what people are writing about now. That's what Mark Solm's work is about. What Freud got right and what Freud got wrong. So I think he just would have been completely tickled, really get a kick out of that. Yeah, that's what I think those books were his ability and his commitment to translating these things into everyday use.
So it's such an interesting combination, the practicality and the science and the grounding in the science. You don't often see that kind of combination of attributes. And
what we have today is a lot of how-to manuals, a lot of branding, and I'm not being flip at all. They're extraordinarily useful, practical techniques, but by and large, they lack an underlying organizing theory that joins them together and helps us resolve the dodo bird problem. Everybody wins and everybody gets prizes, which is kind of where psychotherapies are still lingering. So you're right, it's a very rare thing that someone would really try to bring this into a practical way to the general therapy population.
And he was what kind of a teacher was he?
He was very thoughtful. He was very respectful. He was very clear in what he thought, and he could be. And this probably wasn't everybody's taste, but Mike had an office on the 36th floor of the Pittsfield building, and in very Baschian style, it was like above the highest offices in the building, and it had like a 270-degree view of the city. It was breathtaking, giant office. And one day he stood up and he waved his hand across the city and he said, anybody can be a therapist, but being a good one is a whole other matter, right? So that was one of the things. And the other thing that he said to me was, Jaffe, you're not incompetent, you just don't know what you're doing. You need more facts. And that's the kind of attitude. And, it could be intimidating for some people. I just thought it was totally cool.
And incredibly useful.
Incredibly practically useful. So I think he was very, very early on in understanding things that we continue to struggle with, and we continue to move beyond schools and move beyond the peripheralization of psychoanalysis in the world, and use the varieties of techniques that are out there. Because he also basically felt like psychoanalytic to be psychoanalytic is a way of understanding. What you did with it could be a whole variety of things. I mean, in doing brief psychotherapy, he says, there's a story of a physician, and he says, you need to go for a walk every day. That's the prescription. That was the psychoanalytic, intervention based on, you have to restore people to the spiral of competence. And sometimes you have to give a behavioral command in order to make that happen.
And he would do it.
And he would do it. And he would do it, with that kind of authority. So these things.
And the authority came out of his grounded understanding of why that mattered.
That's right. It was not an arrogant authority.
Right.
It was the authority of knowledge. And I think some of the things that he would say that sounded very superficial, taken out of context, like go for a walk, is a really good example of that. Derived from this deep understanding of what was behind that, and that was the authority. It wasn't authoritarian at all, but it carried the weight of someone who really knew how life worked.
Well, that might be the exact right note to end on, Charles. Thank you very much for sharing your appreciation of Mike Basch and your understanding of his work and his contribution to where psychoanalysis is moving and the way in which it's going to help us bring psychoanalysts of different schools together in a way, hopefully.
One hopes. That would be his great legacy if that is continued by his students.
And at least for one it is.
At least for one it is.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for letting me do this.
My pleasure.